Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us and welcome on behalf of Learnus to tonight's annual lecture. My name is Richard Newton-Chance. Learnus is a pioneering think tank promoting the understanding of how we learn by facilitating and strengthening the dialogue between researchers, practitioners, and policymakers in order to bring about an evolution in teaching and learning. Learnus is dedicated to connecting educators and world-leading scientists who specialize in the study of the brain, the mind, and behavior in order to use the evidence and insights from high-quality research in these multidisciplinary fields to improve and enrich teaching and learning for all. To that end, we are absolutely delighted to have Professor Sue Fletcher-Watson to give the Learnus Annual Lecture this year. Professor Fletcher-Watson is Chair of Developmental Psychology and Director of the Salvesen Mindroom Research Centre at the University of Edinburgh. Microphones and videos will be switched off during the lecture, so please post any questions you may have using the chat facility in Zoom, and we'll pick them up at the end of the talk. The video of the lecture, together with PowerPoint slides, will be posted on the Learnus website in the next few days. In her lecture, Professor Fletcher-Watson will be outlining the neurodiversity paradigm. Neurodiversity is a simple idea at heart that we're all different in how our brains process information, and these differences shape our experience of the world. But when we build on this basic scientific fact, the educational implications quickly become radical and complex. Over to Professor Fletcher-Watson.
Thank you so much, Richard, and thank you all for coming along. It's a real honour and a pleasure to be delivering the Learnus Annual Lecture this year. And I will just bring up my slides so that we can launch into the lecture itself. Yes, I'm Sue Fletcher-Watson. As Richard says, I'm a professor at the University of Edinburgh. If you want to know a little bit more about me, then you can look up my blog on medium.com. Just search for my name, Sue Fletcher-Watson. And in particular, there's a conflict of interest statement up on there if you want to put that, some of what I'm saying today in that kind of context. I'm director of a research group called the Salvesen Mindroom Research Centre, and our main focus really is understanding the inequalities that stem from neurodiversity. So the disadvantages that accrue to people who are neurodivergent, and we have a particular interest in thinking about that within the education system. So I hope that will provide a good underpinning for what I'm going to talk about today. I wanted to start with some thank yous. So like all kind of good quality research nowadays, this is very much, everything I'm talking about very much is a kind of team science approach, and I'm indebted to all my collaborators and advisors and students and colleagues who I work with to help me deliver some of the work that I'm talking about today. And I will credit specific people who've led different projects as we go through. I also wanted to note the fact that all of my projects nowadays are very participatory. So we work with people outside academia in all the work that we do. And because my main personal research focus is autism, that means working with a lot of autistic colleagues. The ideas that I'm talking about today have been generated not just through research evidence, but through hours and hours of wonderful, enriching conversations, especially with my autistic collaborators. And so I particularly want to thank them for their patience and intellect and engagement with the research that we do. I'm also going to very quickly, sorry, this is the last thing before the real meat of the talk, but I want to really quickly flag a conference that we're hosting in Edinburgh next March, which is a specific neurodiversity focused conference called It Takes All Kinds of Minds, or ITACOM. It's going to be a 2-day international event. You can join in person or as an online delegate and watch it all from the comfort of your own home. We're really excited about the conference. We're really going to dig into this neurodiversity idea and think about the implications in clinics and schools and workplaces and communities. So if you're excited by anything I'm talking about today, you want to know more, especially hearing from the people who've inspired me, then ITACOM could be a great conference for you, and I would encourage you to check it out. Okay, so I'm going to say a little bit about the status quo when it comes to how we understand neurodevelopment, and in particular how we understand the kind of atypical neurodevelopmental pathways that some children follow. So I'm talking about autistic children, children with ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, and so on. I'm also going to talk a little bit about the status quo when it comes to inclusion of those children within mainstream education. And I think I'll illustrate that both our psychological theories and our kind of inclusion in schools aren't really working as well as we would like. I'll then propose neurodiversity as a solution to some of those problems, and I'll talk a little bit about what neurodiversity means to me and address some kind of common myths or restrictions on the way that we might understand that concept. I'll then think about how we apply the idea of neurodiversity in schools. So what does this kind of quite philosophical concept look like when we think about, kind of teaching practice? And then I'll give you some examples of our own research where we've taken a neurodiversity model and worked in a kind of evidence-based way to develop resources that can be used in schools. And I'll give you an example from secondary and from primary school. And that's where we'll come to an end, and there'll be a chance to ask questions and you can type them in the chat. And I would encourage you, if a question occurs to you as I'm going along, feel free to type it in right away and we'll pick those up at the end, and Richard will have the enjoyable job of trying to work out which ones to read out to me. Okay, so in terms of the status quo, core deficit theories have driven a lot of neurodevelopmental research. So these attempt to kind of take the diversity and complexity that exists both within and between different diagnostic groups and simplify it into some kind of simple explanation. So there's two assumptions here. One is the core assumption, the idea that everyone in a particular diagnostic category, let's say autism, is similar in some way. And ideally that similarity is sort of fundamental to, whatever we consider autism to be. And then the second assumption is the deficit assumption, right? The idea that being autistic, in this example, represents a deviation from a kind of better or more ideal developmental pathway. So there are lots of examples of these core deficit theories, right? There's a theory of mind account of autism. There's an executive dysfunction account of ADHD. There was, for a short time, a magnocellular theory of dyslexia. I don't think it's really well thought of nowadays, but these have been really kind of common attempts, mostly driven by psychology research, to understand these different diagnostic groups. And these theories don't just drive how we do research, but they also drive clinical practice. So the kind of core deficit model would be that a child or a young person who, perhaps has been identified as showing some developmental delay or to be struggling at school would be referred to clinic for a differential diagnosis, so assigning them to just one of the available diagnostic categories. That diagnostic category then should be associated with this research-led core deficit. And the idea would be that you would do a targeted intervention that addresses that core deficit, and that would lead to a kind of normalization outcome, a sort of correction of the developmental pathway, especially if you get there kind of early enough in life, hence the focus you've probably heard often on early intervention. So I think there's a lot of problems with these theories, and I'll just give you a couple of examples from research of how they're really being undermined. So the core assumption, I think, is being really fundamentally challenged by recent research. So we have more and more large samples now, research samples of participants drawn from a range of different diagnostic groups. And that allows us for the first time to really test this idea that a particular diagnosis is associated with a particular cognitive profile or a neurological signature, some kind of brain feature, or maybe a gene or something like that. So it's true that in these big, rich samples, you can group children according to their cognitive abilities or according to some kind of neurological feature from brain scans or whatever it might be. But really importantly, these groupings don't stack up neatly. They don't map onto each other. So if you look in the figure here, you can see all of the different children represented by the different coloured figures are sort of randomly distributed between these clusters, right? There's a lot of research on this now. If you're really interested to dig into it further, I would recommend this paper by Duncan Astell and colleagues, which is a great kind of introductory text, and a lot of the great work that they've done with the CALM cohort. But there are also similar diverse developmental cohorts all over the world that are really reinforcing this idea over and over again. What about the deficit part? So I'm using an example from autism here. As I say, that's my particular focus. Autism is defined in the clinical diagnosis by social and communication deficits. But what we've found is that when you analyze how autistic people interact with each other, those deficits seem to disappear. So as an example here on the right, in this graph, what we did was essentially a game of what used to be called Chinese whispers when I was a kid, right? So you tell a story to the first person, your first participant in the chain. They have to try and remember it and tell it to the next person, and the next, and the next, and the next. And there are 8 people in total. So the downward slope of these lines reflects the fact that as you go through those 8 people, they forget more and more of the story as you go along, as you would expect. But importantly, when everyone in that chain is autistic, or when everyone in that chain is not autistic, you have really the same slope. So the same rate at which information is forgotten from the stories. When you have a mixed chain where you're alternating between autistic and non-autistic people as you go through the chain, the loss of information happens much more rapidly. That's the blue line, and you can see it drops down much more steeply. So what we're finding from this data is that when there's a mismatch of neurotype, an autistic and a non-autistic person, that's where we say communication and social impairments. So those communication and social impairments that for so long we have said are entirely the responsibility of the autistic person actually exist in a pair of people, in the mismatch between a pair of people. Now, we're not the only ones doing this research. There are researchers all over the world who are investigating this in a range of incredibly creative ways, and I would advise you to Google their names if you're excited to hear more. It's also a phenomenon that's really reaching out into other diagnostic groups. So more and more researchers and practitioners are questioning the labels that we place on particular diagnostic groups, understanding more how much someone's profile might change with the context that they're in over the course of the day, between school and home, for example, over the course of their life, and also how much things might look different between different cultural settings around the globe as well. So there's much more of an understanding that these diagnostic groups that we used to think were kind of true natural categories are actually very kind of contextually shifting. They're not as stable and solid as we thought they once were. And in particular, the idea that we should think of them as inferior pathways to the majority pathway is really being undermined. Okay, so that's the problem with research. How are we doing in our schools? So the first thing to say that in UK schools, there's a load of really fantastic stuff, right? It's great that we have an inclusion policy as standard, but also that specialist environments are available for those that need them. I think our staff in our schools are incredibly dedicated in the face of major kind of challenges, not least not being paid enough. Our education system recently was ranked 11th in the world. We have a 99% enrollment rate, which means if we're doing something in our schools, we're reaching virtually every single child in the UK. And education is really highly culturally valued, right? There's a reason why Tony Blair soared to power in the late 90s by calling for a focus on education, 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 because it really matters in our society. It's something that we all can get behind. But there is some stuff that isn't working so well. You know, our education system is under-resourced. There's a huge amount of pressure, too much crammed into the curriculum. And we're all aware of systemic inequalities in our education system, which means that your postcode, more than your ability, will often dictate what your learning outcomes are going to be. Specifically thinking about neurodivergent young people. So that's people with these diagnoses I've been referring to, autism, ADHD, etc. we know that these children or young people are experiencing particularly poor outcomes in school. So they're more likely to be excluded from school, and when they are attending school, they're less likely to participate. They have lower rates of mental health and poorer well-being, and they're more likely to be bullied and victimized by other students. So our neurodivergent pupils, for all that we are trying to include them in school, are not necessarily having a positive experience, or really what we would hope an inclusive experience would feel like. What about clinical support? So one question is, is this really the responsibility of schools, right? Surely clinical services should be stepping in, particularly when it comes to things like mental health. So this is just an illustration of a really common phenomenon that we see a lot of the time, right? So we've got this imaginary child called Scarlett. She's clearly bright, but she's been fidgeting a lot. She's having trouble concentrating. Maybe she's calling out her answers rather than waiting to be called on by the teacher. It's disruptive in the class. So there's a consensus between Scarlett and her family and her teacher that maybe an ADHD diagnosis would be relevant. So the parents can go to their GP and the teacher can support that, but Scarlett sits on the waiting list in child and adolescent mental health services for 18 months. She's finally assessed for ADHD, but because ADHD is still thought of as primarily occurring in boys, and because she's on her best behavior when she comes in for the assessment, she doesn't get a diagnosis. And her parents need to go to the back of the queue and wait another 12 months to try and get a second opinion. She finally gets her diagnosis confirmed, and the school kind of moves into action to give her some help. So that's the problem with the clinical pathway, right? If you think about an alternate pathway, there's another way to empower teachers to make decisions in the best interest of their pupils in a more immediate sense, especially where those decisions carry a very low risk of harm, right? So one of the things that I would like to see us moving towards is an education system that gives teachers the resources and the knowledge and the confidence that they need to respond to the needs of the children in front of them without necessarily needing to wait for a permission slip from a doctor to take action, which I think is a problem in a lot of our schools at the moment. Okay, so status quo doesn't look so great, especially for neurodivergent young people. Does neurodiversity offer us a better way of doing things? Well, let's think about what neurodiversity is first. So as Richard said, neurodiversity is quite a simple fact at heart, that we all take in information and process it in different ways. And because of those differences between us, that means that we behave in different ways. We respond to things differently. But we can quickly extrapolate that into something that is called the neurodiversity paradigm, which has kind of three quite well-established tenets. So the first is that neurodiversity is naturally occurring in the population. The second is that we don't place greater value on one particular way of being than any other. And the third is that neurodiversity operates much like other dimensions of equality and diversity. So that means when we're thinking about the experience of neurodivergent people of any age, we need to be thinking about those experiences in terms of stereotyping, stigma, prejudice, discrimination, the forces that shape the lives of so many minoritized or marginalized groups in our society. And those forces operate in a really similar way for neurodivergent people. These tenets are laid out really beautifully in this book by Nick Walker. Her writing is fantastic. You can also find a lot of it on her website for free, which is neuroqueer.com. I would add a fourth element to the paradigm. I think this is already implicit, but it's worth drawing out specifically, which is the idea that when we talk about neurodiversity being associated with a kind of strengths-based approach, I think we should be talking about the strength that comes from diversity itself, the collective strength that is brought to the table by the differences between us, rather than the strengths that are inherent in one individual or another. And I'll talk a little bit more about why that is in a moment. But first, I just wanted to introduce you to this metaphor for understanding neurodiversity, which is a great way to really embed your understanding, but also if you want to use this to talk to children in your class or parents or anything like that, this metaphor can really help. So on this slide, we've got 6 trees. 3 of them are apple trees, and then there's a willow tree, a cherry tree, and a palm tree, right? So you can think of this as a kind of diverse group of trees, similar to kind of a diverse group of children that you might see in a classroom. So the first tenet that we can see is this idea of naturally occurring variation, right? All of these trees belong, all of them are very different, but those differences arise through kind of completely natural processes. It's not that one is a sort of unfortunate accidental version of another, right? We can also see how all of the trees have equal value in and of themselves. And in particular, we can see how whether a tree is struggling or not is not dictated by whether it's the right kind of tree. It's about whether it's in the right kind of environment. So the willow tree will thrive in nice wet soil. The palm tree wants a kind of nice dry, hot environment. Neither of those is a kind of impaired version of an apple tree. They're just going to do well if they're in the right context. And that's, you know, a really important way to think about talking, particularly to a child who's struggling, helping them understand or articulate that struggle without feeling kind of blamed or judged, because, you know, you're just saying, well, maybe this environment isn't quite right for you. Let's see what we can do to adapt it so that you can thrive. We can also see a majority status here, so that's the apple trees, and a minority or divergent status. So the palm and the willow and the cherry tree are all individually distinct minorities, right? So you could think of them as being like an autistic child, a child with ADHD, and a child with dyslexia, perhaps. We can also see how everyone is unique, right? So even those 3 apple trees, they are completely unique trees, and there are individual differences between the trees, but you can also see how it's useful to think about the trees in kind of groups as well. And the final thing we can see is this idea of strength coming from diversity, right? So what we want in our kind of woodland, in our garden, is a rich and varied biome that cultivates a kind of rich and varied environment, right? If you're very capitalist, you might want to plant an orchard. You only want apple trees, you want to grow lots of apples and sell lots of apples. And I think that's relevant because I think one of the ways in which we fail our neurodivergent young people as they go through school and as they move into adulthood is by giving them this idea that what really matters is your kind of profit-making opportunity, right? Get good grades, get a good job, earn a high salary. That's the kind of pathway that we're often kind of defining as a successful pathway. Now that's great if you're you know, a capitalist, if you're adopting that kind of capitalist model. But if you want to think more about having a society that is diverse and valuing that in and of itself, then we maybe want to move away from those kinds of restrictions. Okay, so just give me a second. Right, sorry, lots of talking. So let's just talk about a couple of common misunderstandings. And what I don't want to suggest here that there is a right or a wrong way to understand neurodiversity. It's more that I think if we use this idea, there are ways to use this idea that maximize its power and its potential to make change and to benefit people. And what we want to do is drive towards a version of neurodiversity that maximizes that benefit and avoids some kind of risks. So one risky position to take is to use the word neurodiversity just as a synonym for special educational needs and disabilities or additional support needs, or, you know, whatever is the terminology in your part of the UK. There's a risk here that what we do is change our language. You go through a document just cutting and pasting, but we don't actually think about our underlying actions. So we don't make more fundamental changes. There's also a risk that we reinforce pre-existing stigma. So that's already happened when people have attempted to introduce new language, things like special needs. That language is brought in explicitly to try and tackle stigmatized beliefs, but instead what it did was just accrue the stigma that already existed. So when I was growing up as a child, it became insulting to describe someone as special, right? He's a bit special, you would say, even though in any other context, we would think of the word special as being kind of straightforwardly positive. So that's the power of the stigma that already exists. Instead of using neurodiversity then just as a synonym, we need to think more deeply about how neurodiversity requires a rethink of how and why things are done in a particular way. And just to support this position, here's a quote from Judy Singer, who coined the word neurodiversity. And she says, Neurodiversity is not a classificatory term dividing us from them. We are all neurodiverse. We live on a neurodiverse planet in which amoral nature generates endless genetic diversity, while we humans have evolved the capacity to make judgments about nature's bounty. What neurodiversity brings us is a challenge to find a place for everyone and to distribute the bounty fairly, which I just think is the most amazing kind of call to action for all of us wherever we work. Okay, a second misunderstanding I briefly alluded to earlier is the idea that neurodiversity just focuses on the strengths of individuals, right? So it's great to identify the talents that a child has in a particular class and to celebrate those talents. But if that's the only way we apply this idea, the risk is that we put additional pressure on neurodivergent students to excel in something, to compensate for being neurodivergent, for being autistic, or for being dyspraxic, or whatever it might be, by making up for it by having something that they're very, very good at. In that process, we risk also sort of subdividing the neurodivergent community into more or less valuable according to whether they have one of these kind of special talents. And of course, this reinforces this value system that says what really matters about people is their grades and then their future earning power, which is not really a value system that's ever going to be inclusive. Instead, we need to focus on diversity itself as a strength. And this is a quote from June Meadows, who's writing about an article in Forbes magazine, and they said, discussing autism, ADHD, and dyslexia, this article claims the term neurodiversity was created to shift the focus from the negative connotation of these conditions towards the positive, a statement that waters the entire concept down into a floppy, milquetoast version of its former self. It's not a nice euphemism for autism, and it's about far more than just fighting negative connotations. I really love how angry they are in this piece of writing, and I really agree with the emotion behind that. Okay, and this is my third and last misunderstanding I wanted to flag. A lot of people are concerned that adopting a neurodiversity model rejects the concept of disability, and that it means that people would actually be denied the support that they require. And of course, we mustn't do this because it risks failing to be fully inclusive and beneficial to everyone, including people who identify as disabled or perhaps as having a mental illness. The other risk is that, in doing this, when we talk about people as having equal value, it's as if we're saying that, in order to have equal value, you're not allowed to have any support, right? We need to break that connection between the value that someone has in our society and the amount of support that they require. Those two things should be completely unconnected. So instead, the neurodiversity paradigm should embrace the concept of disability, and the key shift is not removal of support, it's about offering support without judgment and without a normalisation agenda. So this is my third quote from another neurodiversity scholar whose work I love, Robert Chapman, and they say, "We should not jump to rejecting the very possibility of mental pathology or of a wrong brain. Rather, we must work on allowing more space for individuals and groups to self-define as healthy or ill, different or disordered, perfect or broken, in need of either medical or political intervention or whatever combination of these." So I think this is a lovely, inclusive way of thinking about neurodiversity and embracing the fact that all sorts of neurodivergent people might seek all sorts of support for all sorts of things that they would like help with, and there isn't like a right way or a wrong way to do that. Okay, so let's think about what a neurodiversity affirmative school would look like in the slightly more concrete terms, and then I'll give you a couple of examples of how we've applied the idea. So in brief, these are my 4 elements of a neurodiversity affirmative classroom, right? It should expect heterogeneity, so variability, diversity in the student body, because as we know, neurodiversity is naturally occurring. It's ridiculous not to expect that variability. It should reject a normalisation agenda because no one way of being is inherently better than any other. It should fight the stigma that dictates a lot of neurodivergent people's experience in the same way that we need to fight stigma and prejudice associated with gender, ethnicity and race, sexuality, and so on. and it respects and makes use of pupils' own expertise because there is strength in our differences of perspective. So just to make that a little bit more concrete, what does it mean to expect heterogeneity? I think for teachers, we need to be vigilant to the stereotypes that are based on gender or ethnic norms, right? So we need to bear in mind that kids with ADHD might be girls, that autistic kids might not be white, right? We need to push back against some of the stereotypes that limit what we see in our classroom and the needs that we identify in our pupils. We need to consider the fact that just because someone has a diagnosis, that doesn't mean that explains everything that's going on with them. And there may be other labels that would apply, or other kind of supports that are available that you don't necessarily link to the diagnosis they have, but would still be valuable. And I think we need to think about, when we create resources to support students in the classroom, making those as freely available as possible. So let's say, for example, that you've decided that one of the pupils in your class has a visual timetable that a speech and language therapist has developed to help them understand the structure of the day. Is there a good reason not to have that up big on the wall where the entire class can see it? Why not put the time and effort that went into making that resource for a particular person and make it available to everyone in the classroom? We need to make use of our pupils. I've put client, this is probably left over from a clinical facing version of this talk, but our pupils' expertise. So create an environment in schools where neurodivergent people can be out, can express themselves as neurodivergent. So in a school, you will have autistic teachers, teachers with ADHD, teachers with dyslexia, dyspraxia, etc. You want to create an environment where they can describe themselves as such, because it's never going to be a neurodiversity affirming environment as long as people are kind of in the closet when they're in the staff room. And similarly, we need to be actively cultivating pupils' own self-knowledge about who they are and what their needs are, and encourage them to advocate for themselves in the classroom and in other settings. I think thinking about access to community, understanding the cultures that are growing up around different diagnostic groups, or in the neurodivergent community more generally, is really important for promoting self-esteem and self-understanding, especially for newly diagnosed young people. We need to reject normalisation. So the criteria that we use to make a diagnosis or to identify someone in the classroom, I think this pupil might have ADHD, I think this pupil might be dyslexic, might be very different from actually what they need to enable them to thrive, right? So try to forget about that diagnostic labeling process and turn your attention, kind of pivot and turn your attention to the actual kind of support needs of that child, which may or may not be the things that you kind of stereotypically connect to a particular diagnosis. Think about what you can do to facilitate access to learning rather than correcting onto a typical trajectory. So a good example would be, if someone is struggling with handwriting, if they've got fine motor control issues, can you provide them with a way to just type their work? Do they really need to be encouraged to practice and practice and practice and develop their handwriting if there's an alternative pathway they could follow? And finally, we need to be working collectively to push back against stigma. So, as teachers, as researchers, as clinicians, and so on, all of these groups of people have authority roles in our community, and we can use that leadership and authority politically as well as in our own practice. So thinking about working with parents and siblings and broader communities to increase people's understanding of neurodiversity, challenging assumptions whenever we see it, and kind of, voting for the sort of change that we want to see in our education system in terms of resourcing in particular. Oh, a note on attendance goals. Yes, this is great. So one of the things I've seen a lot happening is schools that set attendance goals for young people. So, particular number of days that they're supposed to be in. I think this is really interesting. So I think attendance goals are quite a toxic target, right? Because it taps into a lot of anxiety, because it is discriminatory against people with kind of chronic illnesses, and because there are a lot of valid reasons why attendance is not always possible. So I don't applaud these as targets. At the same time, I do think if a school has successfully created a neurodiversity affirmative environment, that should be an environment that pupils want to be part of, right? Where there is confidence that they're going to be nurtured and supported, accepted as they are, where every pupil feels a sense of belonging and a sense of kind of welcome and warmth and so on. And so attendance, I think, in a neurodiversity affirmative school would increase. But I don't think that means we should set it as an explicit target for an individual pupil to meet. I just wanted to say that. Okay, so I will finish in the next 3 minutes with a couple of examples from our own research. So this is work led by Francesca Fotheringham, and you can follow this on Twitter if you're interested to hear more. And this is a project looking at peer support models for neurodivergent young people in secondary school. So as I said earlier, there's a lot of evidence building up that autistic people enjoy spending time with other autistic people. So we thought it would be interesting to explore the value of peer support as a mechanism of kind of well-being for autistic students at secondary school. We did some preliminary interviews with autistic people, and a big suggestion that came out of that is that it shouldn't be just limited to autistic students. This should be about all of the neurodivergent student body having an opportunity to come together. And they set these 3 objectives for the peer support groups. So we created a new model that's designed to kind of deliver these objectives. It was co-designed with neurodivergent educators and neurodivergent young people, and very much inspired by existing kind of peer group work for LGBTQ+ students in secondary school. I don't have results to show you yet. That mixed methods evaluation is happening in 3 schools right now. But just to show how this fits with this kind of neurodiversity affirmative model, you know, this is an inclusive model that includes everyone regardless of their diagnosis, and including indeed neurotypical allies. It rejects normalization. Instead, the goals of the peer support group are about sharing knowledge, creating a sense of belonging, and so on. I think it fights stigma by default. It's about bringing people together and fostering kind of pride and identity around being neurodivergent. And it makes use of pupils' expertise because it's co-designed, but also the groups themselves are about uplifting pupil expertise and cultivating that. We'd like the groups to have a role in kind of campaigning and school leadership, for example. A second example of this in practice is the Learning About Neurodiversity at School project, or LEANS. This is led by Dr. Alyssa Alcorn, another fantastic researcher in my team. She's magnificent. Everyone is. So this is a project that's focused on directly addressing the primary school environment that's created by other people. So the way that other people's expectations and beliefs about neurodivergent kids in the class shape those neurodivergent kids' experiences. We decided what we wanted to do was a model where we teach the whole class about neurodiversity, rather than the more common model of identifying children with additional support needs and separating them out for some kind of specialist training or support. We used a participatory design process with neurodivergent educators to create the resources and pull together this comprehensive resource for primary schools to download and use without needing any training in advance. It was evaluated in 8 classrooms across 4 schools, demonstrating good feasibility and outcomes. And we feel that we had a really strong focus on checking that there was no risk of harm, and we feel confident that that risk was minimized. And so as a result of that, we've now published the resource. It's free to download. It's been downloaded more than 2,000 times in about 50 countries, I think. We're in talks with some people about making translated copies. It's very exciting. And Alyssa is working on 2 developments. One is creating a champions network of educators who are going to be kind of ambassadors for LEANS. And we've also just released a parent pack, which means that parents can download the information they need to recommend LEANS for their child's school. So just trying to kind of empower parents to take that step. And once again, I think this fits with this model. You know, it's a kind of model that embraces heterogeneity because it's accessed by the whole class with no filtering or selection. It teaches about neurodiversity rather than teaching neurodivergent pupils to be something that they're not. It directly addresses people's lack of knowledge and their kind of stereotype-driven attitudes and actions. And again, it was designed in a participatory manner. So I'm going to wrap up now. I'm sorry I've taken a tiny bit longer than I intended to, but I hope it's been interesting. So we've talked a little bit about how existing ways of understanding neurodivergence are limited by their reliance on core deficit models. And in practice, we're not really delivering on the goals of inclusion in the way that we might hope. Neurodiversity and the neurodiversity paradigm provides a new way of understanding how we might deliver an inclusive and positive learning environment, or a neurodiversity affirmative classroom, as I've called it. And these are what the features of a neurodiversity affirmative school would be, in my opinion. And I think we need to create them using this kind of collaborative, co-produced approach towards creating new evidence-based resources, but also thinking about joining forces as a community to campaign for systemic change and better resourcing of our education system. I will finish there. Here are some useful links and reading and things like that. These slides will be up later. And just I'll say one more time how much I think the ITACOM conference might interest some of you. If you've been excited by anything I've said today, then please do consider coming along to hear more. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sue. That was absolutely fascinating. We are getting some questions coming in. I'll start with Stephen Oakes. I love the concept of reframing the message that we're all neurodivergent. It affirms the idea that folk aren't divergent from a gold standard. With that in mind, my question is, why talk of neurotypical at all?
Yes, that is a great question. And I think I'd love to be in an environment where we didn't need to use the term neurotypical. It's very unclear to me that neurotypical really exists. At the same time, I think there is a collective of people, children and young people in schools, adults in workplaces, who just find they click with the system pretty easily. And I would categorize myself in that way. And I think that confers a certain amount of privilege. You know, I think that the way that I was expected to learn, the mechanisms of learning that I was exposed to, were quite easy for my brain to grasp. And I'm not saying like I was clever. I mean, like, you know, that sense of a fit between what the system expected of me and what I was capable of doing. And that, I think, is as a good a way of describing neurotypical as any. And as long as there are people in the system who are advantaged by it, we probably need a word to talk about those people if we're also going to tackle some of those inequalities that I flagged. So I think it's a word that has probably limited scientific validity, but quite a lot of utility in practice, at least for the time being.
Thank you. Jolie Pritchett says, Lean seems so cool. Will there be a secondary version coming soon, or is it quite easy to use in a secondary setting as well?
We would love to make a secondary version, but we haven't got one coming soon. And the only reason is that no one's paid for it yet. So if there's any billionaires in the audience, please do give me a call. The Leans version that we've made is very much for primary schools, and I wouldn't recommend using it in a secondary school setting. We did do some focus group work with secondary school educators who highlighted quite a lot of ways that they would perceive that Leans ought to change to be appropriate for those older children. So, you know, you've got to start thinking about romantic relationships and, you know, peer pressure and much greater independence of young people in terms of, you know, how and when they spend time with their peers. And all of those factors need to be kind of incorporated into the way that we might talk about neurodiversity and the consequences of neurodiversity for people's school experience. So we would love to do that. But at the moment, it's just a matter of watch this space and yes, send any spare pennies you've got our way.
Okay, Faye Cosgrove is asking a question which occurred to me. You acknowledge that schools are underfunded and lacking resources. How do you rationalise your advice to turn away from seeking diagnoses with the reality of the current system in which diagnoses are often essential in order to access funding to allow schools to offer a more heterogeneous context?
Yeah, it's such a good question. It's such a good question. And we're in such a bind for as long as there is that diagnostic gap. It worries me greatly because I think it's a really it's a really messed up system that contributes to existing inequalities. I suppose I would say on a practical level, it's worth, so there are certain kinds of supports in schools that are very high cost. Any kind of one-to-one, staffing-based support, obviously, lots of kinds of technologies and so on. There are other forms of adjustment that can be made that can perhaps make people's school experience more positive and more enjoyable, that really don't cost money. I'm talking about, allowing people to bring in something to fidget with from home, or a cushion to sit on, so that you can kind of wiggle around on your chair and get that kind of movement experience without necessarily needing to kind of leap up and down, or the option to have a movement break. And just creating a culture as well where the way you talk about people's needs signals your total acceptance of those needs and your total willingness to do everything in your power to meet the needs of your students, I think is already very powerful. So I do think we can do more, or empower teachers more to think about how they can use their role and their influence in that sort of way. But I also think, we can't race towards a system which abandons diagnostic gatekeeping if doing so would mean that money stops flowing into schools, right? That's obviously, premature. So, yeah, I recognise that.
It's also the case that it's parental pressure which is driving a lot of the desire to find diagnoses, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And, having an explanation for why things have been difficult for you,
Yeah.
for you as an individual and for your family, is immensely valuable. So, I think that I'm not suggesting that we should abandon having a diagnostic pathway at all. I definitely think that where schools can take action, they should do so immediately without waiting for the diagnostic process to be completed. I would also say that, yeah, diagnosis can unlock access to community, can help you find people like you, people who maybe got some kind of shared understanding of your experience. And, that's immensely valuable, even if we didn't have the system that we have now where a diagnosis unlocks, funding. There are other reasons to maintain diagnosis as a system. But yeah, some of the pathways trouble me, certainly.
Stephen Egg says, recently one of the children who I work with who hates school told me he wants to be a teacher. It's got me thinking about the fact that many, if not most teachers, are folks for whom school worked and did well, as you were saying. Yeah. Hopefully in the future we will have more neurodiverse teachers.
I think that is such an important point, and I completely agree. I think there is that real danger that the people who end up teaching are the people who had a good school experience. Though I'm sure there are exceptions, teachers
me.
Great. Teachers who want to, make it better than it was for them, right? I think there are probably more neurodivergent teachers than meets the eye. I know teachers who haven't felt comfortable sort of coming out, as it were, in the staff room. So it is really important to cultivate an environment at the school where a teacher could say, yeah, I'm autistic, or even I think I might be autistic, because obviously, not everyone has a diagnosis. And then sort of creating an environment, not where those teachers are saddled with all of the labor, but where their expertise and kind of unique insight that comes from their life experience and their professional knowledge is deployed by the school to make a better learning environment. So yeah, I completely agree with that point. Yeah.
What this change in approach, though, is radically different from the one we currently use in most schools in dealing with children who are different or who present with differences.
Yeah.
And the whole of our structures and funding and support is around the recognition of that difference. Yeah. How do we? It's what you're asking for is a fundamental shift in the way schools operate in respect to special education needs, disabilities, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, sure, yeah. I think it is a profound shift, and I'm really glad that you that you frame it in those terms. You know, it would be silly to say that this is easy. I suppose I'm trying to convey a sense that individual educators can make incremental changes now.
Yeah.
Small but important changes. Whether that's, you know, the language that's being used, or, you know, all sorts of things about how things are framed can really make a difference to pupils in terms of feeling like they belong. But ultimately, I don't think we'll be able to say we have a neurodiversity affirmative education system without radical change. It's completely true. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for that, Sue. There are lots of very affirmative comments that aren't questions on the chat about how much people have enjoyed what they've heard tonight, and how it obviously rings with their experiences and their thoughts. So if there are no further questions, colleagues, I'd just like to finish by thanking you so much for that. It's a really, really interesting lecture. Thank you,
Richard, and thank you everyone at Learnus for inviting me. I was really delighted to come and speak.